Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that all of you are well, your families, your colleagues, and of course, all of our students. This is a challenging time, and I know that the strict social distancing measures that uh, governor has put in place is tough. It's tough personally. It's tough economically, but nonetheless, it's the only way that we starve off the virus. So, as I have said throughout this entire challenge, we can either be part of the solution or we will be part of the statistics. I know we all want to be part of the solution. So I appreciate that in the midst of the pandemic, the challenges that our universities and the colleges are facing in the state, and wanted to try to give you a little sense of what we're doing in this regard. We've received a whole host of questions from you. I'm going to try to answer many of those questions as we go through this chat. Obviously, all of us have a responsibility to help each other get through this crisis. And certainly as college university presidents and officials, you have a platform to reach students and young people throughout New Jersey who are struggling at a very difficult time. As someone who has been in public life most of his adult life, I have been through a lot of challenging times, been through September 11th, been through the financial collapse of 2008, been through Superstorm Sandy, but never have seen anything as significant as the challenge that we are facing with COVID-19. And so in the midst of that, I think Congress took some unprecedented action in response to the Congress. Last month, we passed a $2 trillion CARES Act, which included many of the priorities I fought for to help meet the needs of educators and students and families. The package included about $30 billion for our schools and higher education systems, with $14 billion to help colleges and universities mitigate their financial losses and to help struggling students. As many of you know, I believe we fought to get these dollars flowing to New Jersey quickly and led our entire congressional delegation in pressing Secretary DeVos to disperse the aid as soon as possible. And soon after, Senator Booker and I were able to announce more than $323 million had been allocated by the Department of Education to New Jersey institutions of higher education, with half going to support New Jersey students and the other half to institutions to mitigate their losses. I understand that the release of this funding has been slower than what we had hoped for, but that the department is finally beginning to make it available to institutions. I also know that a number of you were hoping for additional flexibility, particularly when it comes to the student half of the funding. However, now that the Department of Education has issued its guidance and began releasing funds, I think it's vital that this funding make its way to students as quickly as possible to help them cover expenses related to the disruption of their daily lives due to the pandemic. As you all work to assist your students during this difficult time, you have my commitment that I'll do everything I can to provide additional resources that our colleges and universities, institutions of higher learning need as Congress considers additional action. Clearly, we have a lot more work to do. Many of you are hearing from students suffering from great financial hardship at this time, and I understand that the CARES Act only begins to fill the massive hole created by revenue losses and increased expenses for institutions. While Congress just this week passed billions of dollars in new funding for small businesses, we need to help our colleges and universities and the students they serve weather the storm. In a future stimulus package, I'm going to be fighting for additional assistance for our institutions, our students, and those with student loan debt. And I look to working with all of you And as we work both in Washington and in New Jersey, our staff is working remotely. Many of you have already worked with Josh Sanders out of our Washington office. He is definitely engaged online and on the phone on any specifics that you have. And Jakima Kunchak is also in our New Jersey offices there as an availability to you. So with that, I want to briefly go through how the CARES Act helps educators and students. It starts off with an education stabilization fund, about 30.75 billion. Distributed approximately 44% to K-12 education, 46% to higher education, 10% to states to supplement higher education and K-12 education funds as needs dictate. Next slide. Funding for New Jersey specifically, next slide. $323 million for New Jersey institutions. 90% of that funding distributed directly to institutions of higher education, 75% to institutions based on full-time enrollment of Pell eligible students, 25% based on non-Pell eligible full-time enrollment. It excludes students already exclusively participating in distance learning online programs. 7.5% of all funding set aside for HBCUs and other minority serving institutions, with the remaining 2.5% for institutions with the greatest unmet need due to COVID-19. Next slide, please. Now, of that 323 million for New Jersey higher institutions have to use 50% of funding for emergency financial aid grants to students for expenses related to the disruption of campus operations due to COVID-19, including such expenses such as food, housing, course materials, technology, healthcare, and childcare. The other 50% can be used for expenses incurred relating to making significant changes to delivery of instruction, moving classes online, for example. The funds can't be used for student recruitment, endowments, athletic facilities, sectarian institutions, or religious worship. Next slide, please. The governor's relief fund gives the governor more discretion to direct the funding to either K-12 or higher ed, depending on where the greatest COVID-related need is in the state. And it largely is about $69 million. It largely supplements the separate K-12 and higher ed funds to provide flexibility depending on the state's or local needs. Help for students, let's go to that. Next slide. What form of relief are students impacted by COVID-19 eligible for? Well, they'll be eligible for emergency financial aid grants from their institutions to meet unexpected and urgent needs related to the coronavirus, such as expenses related to food, housing, course materials, technology, healthcare, childcare. Students who are currently participating in the federal work-study program can continue to receive work-study payments from their institution, even if they're unable to work due to workplace closures. Relief also exists for students who must drop out of school due to COVID-19. Students will have the portion of their student loan taken out for the semester canceled. Next slide. Well, what relief is provided to federal student loan borrowers? Those borrowers do not need to make payments on student loans held by the federal government through September 30th of 2020. The borrowers with commercially held FFEL loans and Perkins loans are not eligible, and private student loan borrowers are also not eligible. No interest can accrue on such loans for the same time period. These provisions provide for more than 37 million borrowers with relief from the financial pressure of making monthly payments for approximately 6 months. Next slide, please. So questions. We've received a whole host of them. We're going to try within the time that's allotted to go through as many as we can. So let's start with the first one, which you can see on the screen there. While we appreciate the federal assistance in the CARES Act, institutions and students across the country are facing financial challenges that go beyond the immediate impact caused by switching instruction online. Can we expect any additional federal assistance in the future relief package? The short answer is we're working on it. In my opening, I made a commitment to all of you that we're going to continue to fight for our higher institutions of learning and our students to get the resources they need to weather the storm. We're going to be looking at what we call a COVID-4, what we passed this week in the Senate and the House. The COVID 3.5 was building upon the CARES Act, particularly for the PPP program, and the EIDL program, which are the small business programs, for the monies that we felt were necessary, a continuing obligation to our hospitals and healthcare workers front line in this process, this incredible challenge. And then because we believe that the only way that we'll get people back to school, the only way that we'll get our economy being able to reopen again is testing and almost universal testing. Because without testing, we are met by the challenge of having not knowing whether going out ultimately means a risk or not, or whether that risk has been mitigated. I only believe that the nation's wealth will get better with the nation's health, and that means widespread testing so that consumer confidence can be out there that if I go, whether it be I go back to school or whether I go to shop at a retail place or whether I go to a restaurant or whatever I might do in the public domain, that the risk to me being infected by COVID-19 has been dramatically reduced and contained. And that would only come to widespread testing. And that was a significant part of 3.5. So 3.4, that's a long answer to this first question, but it encompasses a lot of things. 3.5 was basically an add-on to the small business program with some particular things we thought were critical that we did not originally get offered, that we had to fight for. COVID-4, which would be a much more expansive legislation, would be obviously the place that I would hope to do more on higher education for students, although Senator McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate, has been downplaying the need for COVID-4, but I don't think that his position will be sustained by a majority of the Senate. Let's go to the next question. The guidance received did not contain as much flexibility as we had hoped for. Is it possible to get changes? As I said, we are trying to work on dispensing this aid as quickly as students need it. We are also facing ongoing efforts to try to address issues like DACA eligibility, which is something I have not been successful at. I don't understand it, especially when so many of our DACA recipients are on the front lines in a variety of healthcare positions that are helping us meet the pandemic, but nonetheless, we still face resistance by the administration. We're not giving up on pushing that in a COVID-4, but we're committed to working with you to secure not only additional funding, but to ultimately create flexibility as we move forward. Next question. While we appreciate that the CARES Act set aside funding for minority serving institutions, some New Jersey SMIs are concerned they did not receive funding in the FY20 cycle, therefore being excluded from this relief. Is there any remedies for these institutions? We are actually waiting on further guidance from the Department of Education. It is our view that there should be additional relief under the law, and we are pressing Secretary DeVos in that regard. Next question. I mentioned this, the Department of Education recently put out guidance prohibiting DACA recipients and others not generally available for federal student aid from receiving CARES Act emergency funding. They have significant needs. What can be done to help this situation? Well, I would never encourage any of you to go against guidance from the Department of Education. I do not believe that the Department of Education's guidance on DACA recipients is consistent with the congressional intent in the CARES Act. And it's another example of the administration using a crisis to promote I hate to say this, but a partisan agenda. I'm working with a number of my colleagues to seek change of guidance from the department. The law specifically is silent as it relates to DACA and other recipients. So it did not create any specific prohibition to providing them funding. And therefore, we thought that they should be included at the end of the day. This is a critical part of a fight we're going to continue to wage. There is a letter that's gone out to the Secretary DeVos, citing to her that she has misconstrued congressional intent, and hopefully to see if we can create a change in this regard. Next question. What already secured loans by students, will already secured loans by students before COVID-19 be interest-free or partially or fully forgiven? Well, the CARES Act includes some provisions to help ensure that students who had to withdraw from the semester due to COVID-19 aren't penalized and don't have their eligibility for Pell and other federal student aid programs negatively impacted. Students who withdrew for a qualifying emergency due to COVID-19 will not have to pay back their loans. I have separately called for at least $10,000 in forgiveness for every student borrower, and we will continue to push for such forgiveness in any future relief package. I'm joined in that regard by a series of my colleagues who said deferment is one thing, forgiveness is another. And so we're looking for that type of forgiveness. Next question. Can you join the DC associations in imploring the U.S. Department of Education to relax the financial responsibility score standards for the next 3 years as institutions work their way through the aftermath of COVID-19? I'm hopeful that the Congress is going to work together to provide not only the aid that our institutions, that our students and the families need to get through this crisis and come back as strong as ever. With so much uncertainty about the duration of the need for social distancing measures and stay-at-home orders and school closures, I also think it's difficult to assess the need for blanket waivers to various federal requirements. But I also recognize that without a proven treatment or vaccine for the disease, it may be a slow return to normalcy. So again, we don't know exactly what it will look like, but certainly as the situation develops and the long-term impacts of the crisis come more sharply into focus, I'm happy to continue to work with you all for additional flexibility as it's needed. Next slide. Your leadership, okay, may we continue to call on you for help with the department going forward? Absolutely, it's an easy one. In addition to the obvious lawmaking duties I have as a U.S. Senator, I've always made it a priority to assist New Jersey institutions and residents navigate the federal government and the maze is challenge. That's true every day. It's certainly especially true during a crisis. And we're happy to assist in any way, both at a staff level and myself personally. And I would encourage all of you to reach out to our office. Again, Josh Sanders in Washington, Shakima Krushank in New Jersey, and Rafael Menendez, who is my state director in New Jersey. All of us are available and willing to help you as you continue to navigate this difficult time. Next question. I'm proud of the tremendous efforts Rutgers community to forge ahead with our education, research, and service programs during the pandemic. What more can we do to be helpful to you in your critical work to respond to the crisis? Well, I certainly appreciate that. I'm proud of what Rutgers is doing in this regard. Some critical work is going on through the university, and I think that's incredibly important, continuing to be a advocate, not just for New Jersey, but for the nation. I would say that, you know, one of the things I'm deeply concerned about is the disparity situations we have with the virus. Obviously, the virus knows no class, no income group, no racial, ethnic group, no gender group in terms of discriminating against any of them. But the results, as we have seen in New Jersey alone, I was looking at the numbers, African Americans in a disproportionate way are being affected, and including in mortality rates. And also Latinos are being affected in a disproportionate way. Both of those segments of our society, well beyond their percentage of the population of our society at the end of the day. So research in that regard, and making sure that we advocate with our pharmaceutical companies, as I recently said, sent a letter with a series of my colleagues. Yes, we want the FDA to be more diverse in its clinical trials, but we also want our pharmaceutical industry to be more diverse in its clinical trials, especially when we see a pandemic is affecting certain populations more than others. So that's part of the work, you know, that's certainly looking at the statistical information is always having the science and the data to make the case is always helpful. And Rutgers can be very helpful in that regard, as can others. Next slide. Concerning student loan relief, we need the federal government to provide money to states that have their own programs so that student loan repayments can be made. Moreover, we're concerned about the New Jersey state budget. Our institutions go as the state economy goes, and Governor Murphy has been clear that without more federal aid, the state budget situation will be a nightmare. And that is certainly true. The governor is we've always been friends, but he is now my closest friend insofar as the number of phone calls I've received from any individual. He is continuing to make a compelling case about what the state is going through, both in terms of responding to the pandemic and the consequences that flow from the pandemic. That's why we're very engaged in both some of the CARES Act that created specific pots of money for education and that are focused on education and can be used as uniquely for education. It's also why I have offered, I've gotten bipartisan leadership. I have the senator from Louisiana, Senator Bill Cassidy, a Republican, to join me in a major initiative called the SMART Act, basically $500 billion to the states, divided in 3 different tranches. The first tranche is general assistance to the states based on population. The second, that's 166 billion. 166 billion goes to the states with the highest numbers of COVID-19 cases. And unfortunately, New Jersey is number 2 in the nation, both in the number of cases and the number of deaths. So we would definitely get a significant amount of money from that tranche. And the third tranche is the 166 billion distributed based upon the greatest revenue loss. And again, New Jersey would be well poised under all 3 of those tranches to get a very significant amount of money. This is what I'm looking to achieve in COVID-4. And I believe that a rising chorus of voices, the National Bipartisan Governors Conference, Governors Association has called for this, the National League of Cities, U.S. Conference of Mayors. I hope many of the educational institutions will call for it because, as your question points out, obviously, in addition to any direct aid, what happens for the state will be a critical element. So succeeding at this will be incredibly important. Next question. Can you urge Governor Murphy to abide by the Memorandum of Understanding provisions that you support in the CARES Act rather than asking for a waiver and thus cutting overall higher ed funding? Well, as we just discussed, we see some dramatic decreases in revenue. And I know that public institutions of higher learning, along with other vital programs across many different agencies, are rightfully concerned with what it means for their funding. Congress specifically included a maintenance of effort language in the CARES Act to try to ensure that cuts to education doesn't take place, but the waiver authority is there for states to utilize it if they think necessary. I don't have any doubt, based upon our conversations with governors and members of the legislature, that there is a steep fall off in revenue due to the crisis. And I know that the governor has the highest value for education, both higher education and, of course, our K-12 education. And so to the extent of all of his priorities, he's going to make that a critical element. So the maintenance of effort is going to be something I'm going to be very much an advocate of. But this is why the smart legislation is going to be so critical, because then I don't think the governor will necessarily have to consider those types of options if he has the type of revenue that the smart legislation would bring. Next slide. NJIT conducts about $170 million in applied research, the largest funder of the federal government. The majority of the research has been halted since March 23rd. Will additional research funding become available to research universities, particularly to the various federal agencies, NSF, NIH, NIST, Department of Defense? Well, I know that research dollars are an important source of funding for many of our institutions across the state. Not only is it an important source of funding, it's a great amount of important work that's being done. And I've discussed that with many of you in prior conversations. I've made the same requests that I have of the appropriators, as we are still in the midst of an appropriation process, that there be additional funding in the coming year across a wide variety of programs. And whether that happens through additional relief packages or through the annual appropriation process remains to be seen. I'm obviously pursuing both tracks as we speak, but it will take bipartisan cooperation. And I think that there are a fair number of my Republican colleagues who believe there's a significant need here. Senator McConnell, however, seems to continue to tamp down expectations with a budget caps deal that was already in place for fiscal 21. We'll also need to see if our colleagues in the majority are willing to go beyond those caps, and that will be part of the battle that we'll be ensuring. Next question. Since contributions to the unemployment insurance fund is a criteria for unemployment benefits, and since full-time college students who work on campus do not contribute and are otherwise not eligible for unemployment benefits, will the federal government expand the law to make these students eligible and provide funding in lieu of student contributions to cover the benefits for these full-time students who lost their jobs on campus as a result of the pandemic? And the answer to that question is really highly dependent on the circumstances of the specific student. In the CARES Act, we did include the pandemic unemployment assistance program, which expanded unemployment insurance benefits to those who are typically not eligible for them. Students who are no longer working on campus should be eligible for these pandemic unemployment assistance UI benefits, which would be about 60% of their quarterly base pay and potentially an additional $600 of federal money that was placed on top of whatever is the underlying UI benefit that would be achieved by the state. So in general, I think the answer might be very well yes, but any student who lost their job on campus as a result of COVID-19 may also be eligible for UI and should apply, obviously, for my unemployment at nj.gov. And again, should they have problems, our offices, our constituent affairs director has been helping people who have specific unemployment challenges try to navigate that as well. Next question. Graduate and undergraduate scholarships and or grant aid used on non-tuition expenses like room and board have been taxed as a form of unearned income. Temporarily suspending the taxability of scholarship and or grant aid would permit low and middle income students to retain more of this aid, which they rely on to pay for their college education. Suspending taxability of scholarship grant aid is also important to shield the emergency grant aid to students provided in the CARES Act from being taxable. Would you consider advocating for an exemption to protect, excuse me, our most vulnerable students? This is an interesting idea and one that we can certainly explore as conversations continue to take place on the next package. As a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee, I've worked long and hard to try to use the tax code in a way that benefits different parts of our state in terms of its people, and to alleviate burdens on students and student borrowers. So while much of this legislation has been focused on giving stimulus monies, we also have to recognize tweaks to the tax code that can make a significant difference to students who are struggling financially right now. So definitely will, as a result of your question, be engaged in talking to the Senate Finance Committee leadership as we look at a COVID-4. And I think our last question, in terms of time frame, during this period of economic uncertainty for both students and institutions of higher education, has Congress considered increasing funding eligibility levels and award amounts for our proven federal student aid programs such as Pell, Perkins, SEOG? Doing so would help us maintain enrollment and improve access while many families face dwindling resources. Well, like the research funding question we talked about before, I've long pushed for increases outside of a pandemic to federal student aid programs. So I understand as the first in my family to go to college and then later go to law school. Without Pell and Perkins and work study, I would have never been able to go and afford St. Peter's College, go to Rutgers Law School. And without that, I certainly wouldn't be a United States Senator today. So I'm very focused on this even before we had one of the largest Pell increases that we got in the last appropriations process. And obviously, the case is made more dramatic now. So that same advocacy that I had before will be certainly reinforced as we deal with this this pandemic. Of course, again, it will take bipartisan support in the Senate. And I'll just use your question as I sign off here. Some people ask, why did you all take so long? By congressional standards, a few days is not long, I can assure you. But the reason that we did not come to an immediate agreement is a lot of what we talked about in the CARES Act today was not in the legislation that we were offered by the Republican leadership in the Senate. And it was only through our insistence that we would not sign on and vote, as much as we wanted to be expedient and emergent at the end of the day. We would not do so unless there was additional funding for different categories, including the education funding that we've talked about. And that became a reality as a result of our withholding our votes until we came to a negotiation that represented all of the interests that we thought needed to be dealt with in the midst of this pandemic. So that's what it took to add the $25 billion for testing in yesterday's votes on CARES 3.5. It's what it took to add additional hospital funding. It's what it took to add unemployment compensation because that wasn't in the package that we had. So many of the provisions that we've talked about today only came because of our insistence. And it will need bipartisan support, and we will continue to insist on it as we look forward to any future package. But certainly, we're going to be an advocate for that. I appreciate both your insights and your questions. This is a continuing dialogue. Consider it such as we continue to move forward. I appreciate what you do for this great state and its people in terms of the incredible education that is delivered. I'm always proud of New Jersey's universities and colleges in the performance of its students and its placement of those who ultimately graduate and gainful employment, in the research that is being done at our institutions that are not only in service to New Jersey, but in service to the nation. So thank you again, and stay safe. I'm convinced that we will get through this difficult time. And we have to think about what the future looks. How do we both prepare for it so that we never face ourselves shortchanged in any way, and that we also think about how we create an even more resilient economy and a better life for all of our citizens. Thanks again for joining me, and stay safe.